When the past comes back into your life, you tend to start thinking about what could have gone wrong recently. At least that's how I started thinking, trying to find the cause already in the present. Playing back further and further until I find that tentative point where things started to go wrong. This is especially important now, given the past that has begun to overtake me. Each of you with warmth and trembling can say the phrase, "Give me back my 2007." At the same time remembering something exclusively your own, secluded and beyond the pressure of time. I think it is not necessary to focus on it. Who remembers, he will understand, and others it will not be especially important. It's just that this time, and is the very point to which I had to play everything back, after who a couple years ago popped up in my life again. Personally, I hate that damn year and would never want it back again, and now I'm going to try to tell you why. 2007 was the year my family and I moved to another city. My 9th grade year. I was not a sociable person, which I am to this day, so my parents' spell of find new friends did not work, no matter how many times they repeated it after the move. Things weren't going particularly smoothly in my family back then. My parents were kind of on the equator of their relationship, and now years later, I roughly realized that it was a test of circumstances and time. Even if I had understood anything in adulthood, it wouldn't have helped me in any way at the time. Back then, and probably now, you don't talk about it, especially with kids. In the class I was assigned to, I didn't fit in right away. A group of years of United Majors, looking down on everything, junkies, and hope of the school in one person. The first weeks I even tried to communicate with them, but somehow I quickly got lost in my own society, on the sidelines of the class. The only thing that kept me in this world was the Supreme, aka the Holy Trinity. Black metal, Time Zero, and the music school where I studied guitar. It was these three pillars, three mental pillars, that helped me conventionally survive at that time. Of course, I was not one of those warriors that, fighting with reality, get drunk or start chasing people while the remnants of a leaky attic give warmth to my shoulders. But I had my own answer to total hopelessness. A Gorgoroth t-shirt, which for me was a shield from the world. Thanks to it, I could once again walk through the meaningless, gray, identical everyday life. This t-shirt saved me, but it also became the factor that eventually ruined me, as cliché as it may sound. At the end of September, I remember, as always, coming home from music school. That day it was raining a monotonous, cold rain. Since childhood, I had a habit of walking through yards, and in the new city from the music school, I almost immediately had my own shortcut. Through vacant lots, a soccer field, garages, and a piece of abandoned land where huge concrete slabs left over from a dead construction site were stacked. There, on these slabs, not hiding from the rain, sat a large company. Gorgoroth, holy shit, Malloy, come on over here. A dude with long hair in a black, worn-out hoodie separated from the group of people. Underneath it, you could see a t-shirt with a burnt-out church on it. They were drinking port wine, listening to music and putting their faces in the cold rain. In 2007, it was all Emery and goth, and from the look of them, at first I thought that this group was near goth. But then the dude who called me introduced himself. "I'm Lekka," he said. "We are kind of Otzi Sotanists. Well, you know what I mean." He joked and we shook hands. Then he introduced me to their company, which was not small. In the company, Lekka was called Lestat, because of the external similarity to the main character of the movie Queen of the Damned. There was also Nora, one-armed Tolian, Uncle Igor. He was already years old at that time, and everyone called him Uncle. Marina, Katia, who in the middle of her life realized that her name was Marina, but everyone called her Marina for fun. Gray Sergey, he was 18, and he was already all gray, hungry, aka Kirill, a dude who never ate, and no one in the company had ever seen him eat. There was also Mother Valia. Why she is a mother will become clear under terrible circumstances. Archpriest Mikhail, in my memory, whenever I did not come to the company, he was always lying drunk, and I knew him in absentia. There was also Shurikaliso, because he drove a car and when it was necessary, drove us. Oil, Shaman, Anya, Pension, Vitya, Mirage, Stas, Vovin, Mitya, and his friend Pizdes. There were much more of them when the company went out of town to the nature. I can't remember them all. It was Lestat who introduced me to everyone, and he took custody of me. Kind of like they were Satanists. I don't remember an episode where Lestat mentioned it specifically. He spoke of it more as a joke. Whether or not it was a joke was hard for me to understand at the time. In addition, they said and believed that our world was far from what they thought it was. They believed in the beyond and mysticism. They made regular trips to abandoned places, bad places, cemeteries. Before I met them, after music school, I used to go home and play Time Zero until early morning, but now I went out with them every day. We'd drink port wine, wander somewhere along the tracks outside of town. Toward night, we'd go somewhere on the territory of abandoned factories, on the technical floors. Sometimes they would write something on the walls with a cylinder. Sometimes we would make fires and warm ourselves near them. There was no goal as such, a huge company. Maybe it was an end in itself. The bigger, the better. A month passed, probably, and I had a chance to communicate with almost everyone personally, to get to know them better. Even the 2-meter-tall and formidable-looking pussy, and that one turned out to be, in fact, quite a good-natured dude who loved 8-bit consoles and could talk about Dandy for hours. With all of them, I more or less managed to establish communication, except for Uncle Igor. No matter how I tried to make conversation with him, and in what degree of drunkenness he would not be, he always told me the same thing: "Fuck off, kid." Everyone in the company called me Little because I was the youngest of the bunch. For some reason, my presence irritated him. He did not hide his aggression towards me. If possible, he called me a dickhead and sent me away. At first, I didn't understand why it was happening. There was even a time when he threw an empty beer bottle at me. The day Lestat told me I was ready to be initiated. Then Uncle Igor shouted something, as he usually did with me. His words were drowned in the noise of the huge company. He was the only one, as it turned out, who still tried to throw me a helping hand, to warn me about everything, to give me a chance. I didn't realize it that night, and then, as is usually the case, it was too late. "You have to pass a couple of tests that will prove you're worthy," Lestat said, and led me to the first of 2 tests. The first test was complete nonsense. Every one of us had passed it, even Kamarina. It was evening, and we were walking towards one of the bedroom neighborhoods. You've heard the story about the Gorky sadist, our city maniac. Killed children in his apartment in broad daylight. Tortured them in such horrible ways that the case files are still classified. You know what his specialty was? He rented an apartment in a house for the deaf. Yeah, we got one of those in town. There used to be a whole dormitory for the deaf. Some vocational school or something, and in the 90s, magically, the rooms became apartments. Magic. In this house, then so it went on, apartments were taken only by the deaf. I do not know how, maybe word of mouth, he said with a laugh and continued. And this old fuck got the idea that only deaf people live there, and in his case it's almost ideal neighbors, and started taking his kids there. No one could hear the screams anyway. Of course, not Chikatilo, but by the standards of our city, organized a natural genocide. 8 kids, in just 3 years. Probably he could have kept on doing it, but he started to drink like hell and got caught for forgetting to close his door. He got drunk, pissed himself, and fell asleep in the process. Some of the neighbors looked in, and it was like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, so they busted him. His hut was sealed up, and then outrage. They tried to burn it down a couple times, smashed the windows, organized pogroms. Well, we didn't sit idle either, so we started visiting there. Viktor Andreevich took me there personally, locked me up at night. "This is your first test." We walked up to a 5-story building that didn't stand out from the other houses and went inside. An ordinary entrance, an ordinary staircase, and a corridor. The last detail was not typical for apartment buildings. There were doors along the corridor, like in dormitories. We went up to the 5th floor, reached the end of the corridor. There, at the very dead end, was a dirty, mat-scribbled door. Lestat started jingling his keys and opened the big padlock. The inside reeked of piss and construction dust. The room was empty, only the knocked-down planks of hardwood flooring lying everywhere. No furniture or signs that anyone had ever lived there. Lestat's flashlight shone around the sides. All the walls around him were covered in graffiti and foul language. It was as if everyone who'd been here in all this time had left an inscription as a memento. Although visually there was nothing creepy inside, the feeling of being inside was quite unpleasant, kind of oppressive. Shit was coming into my head. Not fear, but something heavy, some unformed regret, bitterness, mortal longing, a sense of helplessness. "Look what's about to happen," Lestat began. "It's very simple. You give me the phone, and I'll lock you up until morning. In the morning, at first light, I'll be as quick as a bayonet," he said and held out his hand, waiting for my phone. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, not understanding what was happening. "You have to wait and listen carefully. Here dwell the spirits of those who have not been heard. The main thing is not to be frightened. You know why Seryoga is gray? He was too much scared." He clapped me on the shoulder happily. "Whatever you see here at night, whatever they tell you, don't believe it. They'll scare you, but not out of anger, more out of boredom. They haven't felt anything for a long time. Remember, they're dead. You're not here to wait for the morning. You're here to prove to our company that you're worthy." Viktor Andrejevic was a smart man. He found consistency. He knew how to make the transition. "Soon you will understand everything. Be patient. To stay here overnight, it is important to transition. Be very attentive. But I repeat, whatever you see here, remember, they can do nothing to you. They are long dead." Holy shit, man. This is some kind of ape. "You're locking me in here and leaving? Should I draw a circle on the floor?" Lestat laughed. "Okay, give me the phone and I'll go. Don't piss off, I've been here too, and I was fucking scared too, especially when Viktor Andreevich told me about all this. He was a great man. Okay, give me the phone." I put the phone in his hand and stood still. "At least give me a couple of cigarettes." "Not supposed to. The light might scare away the dead and attract people who shouldn't be attracted." "Okay, I'll see you in the morning. Hopefully." He laughed and closed the door from the outside. His last phrase really stuck with me. After he left, I remained standing in the same spot in the center of the room. I could still hear footsteps in the hallway, and I didn't want to be there. Suddenly, there was some realization of the stupidity of what was happening. I liked their company, spending time with them, talking about music and drinking alcohol. I didn't have any other friends. School was terrible. My parents were always fighting at home, and before I left, they didn't even ask me which friend I was going to sleep over with. Lestat's company was more than just friends to me, even if it was too naive now, but I didn't want to lose them back then. I didn't want to betray their trust or be labeled a weakling. That's why I agreed to all this. I didn't have a watch, and it was hard to judge the passage of time. From time to time, there were noises inside the house. A hum, like when a washing machine goes to spin. The occasional slamming of a door somewhere in the back. Pretty soon, that noise died down as well. The house was very quiet. There was nowhere to sit down inside the room, and the whole time I just stood in one place. The window on my right hand whistled occasionally, letting in the cold air. It was repeatedly blocked with boards and pieces of furniture, and there were no openings. The darkness was such that, waving my hand in front of my eyes, I couldn't see it. If I took a step to the side, I would cease to realize where I was in space. While my place was unchanged, I had a picture of the room in my head. The front door on the left, a window on the right, a wall behind me, and a piece of planking ripped from the wall of a recessed closet. There were a lot of chaotic thoughts in my head. What the transition was, who Viktor Andreevich was, and why Lestat spoke of him with such respect. Standing in one place, I kept my hands in the pockets of my pajta and shifted from foot to foot. The room was getting colder. I don't know how much time passed, but gradually my arms and neck began to get stiff. Moving my shoulder blades and twisting my head, I warmed up. The hands in the pockets of my paita became icy cold. Pulling them out, I tried to pull up the sleeves to hide my palms inside. My right hand went through without a problem, but the sleeve on my left was bunched up. Straightening my hand along the seam, I shook it and pulled it down. It was just a second, a blink of an eye. It happened too fast to cry out or recoil. A small, cold hand gripped my palm and held it tight. Fear gripped me. There was a monstrous strength in that small palm. Something was holding me, clenching my palm tightly, forcefully. The little hand was pulling me down, leading me somewhere. 1,000 times I'd seen horrors, and just as many times I'd put myself in the protagonist's shoes. But when something clearly out of the norm happened to me, I didn't want to scream. In my heart, I believed it was Lestat and company's doing, that there was a secret doorway somewhere and they'd snuck in unnoticed. But this cold, scalding and real was far more powerful than all the arguments of reason. Whoever was there began to lead me around the room, in circles, holding my hand. Gradually, the circle grew wider and wider. With each circle, we were closer to the walls. Getting out of those cold, clinging little hands was not worth trying. On one of the laps, I tried to pull my hand toward me, and I heard a growl from the floor. I wanted to believe the prank, but with each new lap, my arm went from an upright, slumped at the seams position to an increasingly horizontal direction. It was as if whoever was holding it was moving freely on the wall. My head went round and round. I started to feel nauseous. I don't know if it was the 1,000th circle or the 10,000th, but my stomach was begging for more and more. My hand was almost over my head, and whoever was holding it was speeding up. It was getting very hard to keep up. My head was spinning, my eyes were flashing, and I could smell the heavy metallic odor of blood in my nose. It went on for an eternity, and then I threw up, and the one holding my hand let go. By the sounds of it, he ran off into the distance, a minute, then another. In the small room, it caused another bout of nausea. For a few seconds, only the echo of his running could be heard, and then silence came. I was still nauseous. Now the room had the bitter stench of vomit in addition to the smell of construction dust. Soon, in space, it marked a separate area of the room, which for that night I tried not to go near. Squatting closer to the door, I tried to gather my thoughts. I still had the belief that Lestat and the rest of our group were at the door, that they were just testing me, and that if I knocked, it would all be over. To them, I'd become a sucker and a coward. The reverberations of weakness after the nausea interfered with my thinking as much as the fear I felt. Added to that was a cold that wasn't normal at all. Breathing to warm my hands, I rubbed my palms together. I did so until something from the darkness began to breathe on my palms too. Only cold air. Dizziness and nausea again. The night was endless. There was no way the gaps were appearing in the area where the window should have been, and Lestat, as luck would have it, was not there. It seemed to me that inside this room, my stay had been going on forever, that I was about to see him and he would open the door. And along with it was another feeling no less strong. The fear that only 20 minutes had passed, and that it was more than enough time for something else to happen. Without noticing, however, he began to make out details of the room in the darkness. It was just beginning to get light. Light was shining through the tiny slits in the room. As the room grew lighter, time seemed to speed up, and soon Lestat came for me. With him was Nora, one of his most loyal friends, and Shurawil, who had brought them. They cheered me up, clapping me on the shoulder. "You're really good. Well done. You did it." Nora and Shurakaliso didn't ask anything. We smoked a cigarette on the street. They got into the car, and Lestat and I stayed standing on the street. "How was it?" he asked. "Did you slip me something?" Some kind of drug? What was it? We didn't slip you anything, Malloy, you know it was real, he said and added. Don't tell anyone what you saw there, especially what they told you. They told me nothing. Nothing at all. Well, what you saw then is not a word about it, said Lestat as if apologizing. You saw it? I didn't see my palm in front of my face, and I didn't see, hear, or understand a damn thing. That was the end of the conversation. We got in the car, they drove me home, and we said goodbye. When I got home, the first thing I did was to take a shower. My parents were still asleep. It was the 7th hour of the morning. I took off my clothes and went into the shower room and began to wash myself. The water seemed something sacred, as if it washed away what had happened. Gradually, the events of the previous night, those experiences, did not seem so acute anymore. I still had a suspicion that Lestat and the boys had slipped me something, and everything that had happened was nothing more than a hallucination. And then I saw my left hand. There were 8 little dirty stripes on it, the mark of a small palm. I didn't want to understand that. It was beyond all explanation and the safe picture I had almost formed. What was on my left palm defied not only logic, it was alien to our world. Dirty footprints, 8 little fingers. Could it be another sleep deprivation? Soap was powerless, so was a loofah. The only thing that helped was a heel pumice stone, and that was after the blood showed. I didn't tell Lestat about it, I just came back the next day with a bandaged arm. The next few weeks went by as usual. We drank, walked somewhere outside the city, and gathered in the evenings at an abandoned kindergarten. There, inside the 2-story house where the 2nd floor had collapsed, on a pile of beams and stones, we often spent our evenings there. It was there that Lestat told me that my 2nd trial was coming up. I had enough of the 1st trial, but I didn't want to lose my friends, which I considered them at the time. We had a good relationship with Lestat. He came to my school a couple times with Pussy, Shaman, and Nora. Visited with the majors from my class. So soon I was out of the class. Lestat had a way with people. He had a kind of natural charisma. He had been an orphan since childhood and lived with his grandmother until he was 15. He didn't work, but he had money all the time. Often we could cut off from the general company, and he would give me excursions to the places of military glory of the Neforsky movement of the 90s. Old Nefers, musicians who never became popular, poets of one verse, desk writers, failed artists. They were interesting people. What they all had in common was that they had failed at some time or another. Lestat never talked about himself in the context of creativity. Being an endlessly interesting conversationalist, he managed to sidestep the subject so deftly that the question became irrelevant in the process. In addition, he knew how to inspire, to support, and of course he knew how to push where necessary. Manipulate, create guilt, play on it. Said that in our company, because of my youth, I was stressing a lot of people out. Pressed me to pass the final test. Oil, Mother Valia, and Pensia, so constantly against the fact that you are called with us, even Archpriest Michael, I have already expressed to me about it, said Lestat. I've never even talked to him. He's always drunk. There was not a single time that I saw him conscious. I resented him. You see how important it is to show yourself now so that even people like him, no questions. This time the test took place in the cemetery. Now there was a whole crowd of us. Shurikaliso was pulling shovels out of the trunk, and Mother Valia was running through the low cemetery fences with cries of, "Where are you, my little hungry one?" Nora and Pizditz drank a shot of cemetery vodka each and sat down at a table in one of the cemetery plots. Maslow, gray-haired Sergei, Mitya, and Kamarina were talking about something standing at the entrance to the cemetery and did not come to us. Uncle Igor, seeing me once again, called me a dickhead and passed by. Lestat, hungry and one-armed Tolian, reached Shurikol's car and began to take out of the trunk no less strange things in the light of the evening. Lestat had not told me what the ordeal would be, but when I saw them taking out shovels and a small, but obviously smaller than me, coffin from the trunk, I had a bad feeling. Something between déjà vu and fainting, like it had already happened. A long time ago, in cyclical time, this event was so far behind me that it was already beginning to peek through as a future event. Looming on the horizon, the last to arrive were Mirage and Vovin, two guys in their 20s who sometimes asked me to show them a couple of chords on the guitar. They were carrying a meter-long mirror wrapped in newspaper. You're not going to have the easiest path today, but luckily if you get through it, you'll be ready to transition. You'll need to bury your reflection, along with the mirror and whoever is reflected in it besides you. But don't be frightened. As long as the mirror is intact, you're in no danger. Look, be careful, you cannot look anywhere besides the mirror, otherwise you risk to see the one who is reflected in the mirror only in reality. It's very simple. Hold it firmly in your outstretched arms. Look at yourself, look behind your back. Just don't look around. Look back or take your eyes off the mirror. You risk becoming a portrait on one of the graves, Lestat said, and instead of his typical chuckle, he became even more serious. Really, Malloy, what was at that hut at night? A complete bullshit. Here you can and quack. Viktor Andreevich wouldn't lie. He's seen a lot of things in his life. Anyway, we'll go dig a grave for... Instead of words, he interrupted and nodded his head at the mirror. And you go with Hungry, Oil, and Uncle Igor, they will show you the starting point. In fact, everything is not as scary as it seems. Just follow the call, and watch who's following you. Use the mirror. They can bring you in a minute to the right grave, and can lead you around the cemetery, but you do not piss. The main thing to remember is that as soon as you reach the grave and the coffin, lift the mirror on the same outstretched arms a little above your head, and do not look at it. Put it in the coffin, and our people will be there. They will close it with a lid, and that's all. We'll bury you next. Lestat laughed. Well, not you, but your mirror, your reflection, I'll tell you later. Come on. Don't let me down, little man. He said and went with Pussy and Mitya to dig the grave. I went to Hungry, Uncle Igor, and Masel, expecting them to take me to the starting position. We started moving deep into the cemetery. At the side, pressed against one of the tombstones, sat Mother Valia. At first I thought she was just hugging the tombstone, but then I looked closer. Mother Valia held her pale breasts and pressed them against the oval convex portrait, to the lips of the dead man in the picture. Oh, Mother Valia is feeding the baby, said Maslow and smiled. We passed by, and she kept babbling something under her nose and poking her breasts at the portrait on the stove. Hungry was carrying a mirror and telling Maslow something, and Uncle Igor kept reminding me what a doloyub I was, and that it was better that I had never been in their company. Quite quickly we came to a small hill, where old wreaths, broken branches, and other cemetery trash were piled in a heap. Hungry gave me a mirror, Maslow wished me luck, and Uncle Igor once again called me names. So they left, leaving me alone. The mirror wasn't too big, maybe a meter long and half a meter wide. Its size only obstructed my view of the front. As I held it in my hands, I kept thinking that it was going to break, because it was too unreliable to the touch. Lestat's words came to mind. Many bad thoughts came into my head that night, but none made me give up the absurdity of it all. I didn't want to lose the only friends I had, so I slowly began to move. I had no idea where to go. I stepped carefully, looking at my reflection, barely visible in the moonlight or at the darkness behind me. His arms got clammy very quickly. Not even 10 minutes later, his shoulders began to burn. It made me want to quit the whole thing even more. Give up the mirror. Don't rush it. Are you out of your mind? Think about what you're doing, said a very familiar voice in front of me. It seemed to me that it was someone from our company. Slightly distorted his voice and speaks to me. Stas? Pension? And no, Vovin. I enumerated. The same voice sounded again, only behind my back. What did he tell you this time? That they'll bury your reflection? Aren't you afraid that you're a reflection? That the coffin is for you? Aren't you? You haven't thought about it? A second's pause, and the voice comes from the front again. Have you thought about the fact that everything you do may not just be posturing, but may have direct consequences? Have you considered the cost of such rituals? Someone threw a small pebble at my back, then another. Not hard, they seemed to be throwing them, aiming at the mirror. The rubble fell somewhere behind me, then at my feet. In the reflection, I saw only faintly distinguishable figures. Everything merged. Stone slabs, trees, silhouettes. Behind me, in the distance, someone was definitely there, and I wanted to believe that it was just a prank of someone from the group. The voice kept coming from in front and behind me. I moved only forward, treading carefully and slowly. Pebbles still occasionally fell near me, but much less frequently. At the time, I was 100% sure that what someone in the company was saying was all a good play, but as I moved deeper into the cemetery, the picture in the reflection of the mirror completely discouraged me. Moving forward, the reflection of what was behind me didn't get farther away, but instead came closer. Completely broke my brain. After that, I began to step backwards. From that moment, there was silence. No one spoke to me anymore. Now I was scared. It's good to be able to just not believe. It's a great help. But when something like this happens, the mind gives up, shuts up, and you have to be alone with it. That's what happened to me. What was happening? I couldn't get my head around. Not until I began to see barely discernible flashes from behind me. And then any discussion of sanity or insanity was unnecessary. The short flashes were repeating at different intervals, and as I moved backward, their size increased slightly. They were jumping at strange angles, and I couldn't figure out what they were. If I turned the mirror a little, the flash would come from one angle, then a little more, then another. The way back didn't last too long. Something was getting closer to me and getting farther away with it. The sounds behind me grew louder and louder. A step. Someone was getting closer. If I stopped, he stopped too. My thoughts no longer revolved around the company. They were more somber. There were some guesses, and it soon became clear that they weren't that far from the truth. Someone behind my back was approaching. As he approached, things quickly came together in my mind. This someone was also carrying a mirror like me, on outstretched arms, and was also walking backwards. He was completely repeating my actions and seemed to be mirroring me, one and the same. And then we collided. In the upper corner of my mirror, I could see the edge of his mirror. What was happening seemed surreal. The moonlight was barely enough to see anything, let alone be able to see who was behind me. It didn't look like a setup from Lestat. Whoever was behind me was obeying my actions. He wasn't doing anything of his own, just repeating. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see him, only a piece of his head. No obvious creepiness, and that only made me feel worse. Fear needed to get out somehow, but in this horrible situation, my brain couldn't find any external horrifying images, and soon it was as if it had begun to draw them on my face. In the darkness, there was already something scary, but now they were quite real features. Branches, thorns, they seemed to be sticking out of my head. The ugliness of the face was constantly transformed into sharper and rougher shapes, and as it transformed, the one behind my back was staring back at me harder and harder. It was as if he had ceased to be a reflection, and began to impose on me movements that I could no longer obey. As he pushed, he shifted to the side, bypassing me, and in a short moment we switched places with him. He was now in the place where I had stood a few seconds before, and without any moral or visible hesitation, he began to move away, and I began to move away as well. Now, as I moved forward, the reflection was not coming closer as it had been before. Now it was moving away. After that, my journey did not last long. Voices became discernible ahead. It was Lestat and our boys. They were waiting for me. When I reached them, I remembered Lestat's instruction, and lifted the mirror above me, closed my eyes, and plunged it into a small coffin. It was only then, after I'd recovered from the experience, that the burning pain in my shoulders came over me. "You can open your eyes," Lestat said. Mitya and Pussy started to bury the grave, and Lestat offered me a walk. "You made it. Well done. No one really believed in you, to be honest. Soon it'll all make sense to you, and what seems like bullshit to you now will make sense. You've probably wondered more than once what this is all about. I think I should tell you about Viktor Andreevich first, and then about the transition. Have you heard the urban legend about the fours?" Lestat asked. "Well, yes. Elevator 666. All that stuff. Mirage told it to me not so long ago." "Do you know why they're quadruplets?" "Well, like all the apartments in the building were fours, 1 4, 2 4s, and so on," I said. "No, I'm not. You've probably heard the story that in that house, if you press the number 666 times in the elevator, you get into a dimension where there is no way out and everywhere is the number 4? But this is just a story, but it has its roots in a real story. Once Viktor Andreevich told me the real story of that house. The 4. Why it has such a bad reputation in our town. I've heard about the rubble in the mines, especially when methane explodes. In '91, we had one of the worst accidents in the city's history. Over 100 people. Then the authorities busted their ass to show compassion. It was the beginning of a new era. We had to earn points. The mayor promised new housing for each of the affected families within 2 weeks. He tore up 12 regional repair crews and drove them to 5 floors of bare walls. He brought in people who had nothing to do with construction, especially residential construction. Day and night, they were fucking around, making such non-standard construction solutions that they eventually turned from ugliness into a form of genius. They made it out of whatever they could scavenge from the region, literally anything. They put a shaft elevator instead of an elevator in an apartment building. They put apartment doors inside rooms, baths, and toilets. Window moldings inside the apartments instead of windowsills. In one part of the house, the transition from the 4th to the 5th floor, they put a section of the stairs upside down. It's like they built it with downers. It's like Frankenstein's house. They shit themselves, made a shabby, unlivable ugliness, but in 2 weeks they managed, and all the families of the victims, of which there were more than 100, were given the keys. Now imagine what it was like to live there, especially after such intense grief. A day didn't pass, and their sewage started flooding the upper floors, because someone had installed the risers incorrectly. You'd think you'd have to complain, but here we are rebuilding and it's all fucked up. No money, no work, you have to survive somehow. So they lived in this ugly place. So what does this have to do with us? I interrupted Lestat. And because this house, the 4 of urban legends, has been absorbing human suffering like a sponge for years, the mayor's office began to give apartments to those who had lost someone in accidents on a regular basis. People were put in this house to die, and some people didn't even need to be moved. It was like something was pulling them there. They'd rent a place there, and then they'd disappear just like that. You see, this house, because of all the suffering accumulated in it, because of all the pain, as if warped the space of our world, burned a hole in it like a cigarette in a sheet. Some disappear in it, and others can use it for their own good. That's exactly what Viktor Andreevich was. You see, he found me. He came from another world. He told me how to travel. He changed my life, helped me become a human being. Before I met him, I weighed 409 pounds and I was in the system. Nora and I were living out our last days at my grandmother's house, huddled together for all we could. Nora lay dying in the hall, and I was going to hang myself in the bedroom out of hopelessness. And then a miracle. A knock on the door, and there's a man on the doorstep. Allkind called me Sonny. I've been an orphan since childhood. I've never seen my father and mother alive. My grandmother wouldn't even speak for them. I thought at first that it was some sectarian, Sonny, But then I decided to just hammer it out. I took him as a sign from above. And life began to change before my eyes with his appearance. Soon I quit, and then Nora jumped off. Viktor Andreevich started coming to our house every day. He brought food, alcohol. We drank and talked. For a long time, I perceived him as a super-loving grandfather who could drink half a liter of vodka in one go, and then immediately squeeze himself off the floor more than 100 times. Soon Nora and I realized that grandfather was not as simple as he seemed. Then he grilled us about the structure of the universe, then told us that time was subject to interference. We did not understand the meaning of his words, but the more we got to know him, the more the world changed, and then there were his rituals. I was just like you now, asking, "What's this for? What's the point?" And Viktor Andreevich suggested patience. And then there was this, Lestat said, and waved his hands around, referring to the cemetery. Viktor Andreevich told us that he came from another world, and that it was possible to get there if you built and observed the right sequence of certain actions that could affect the world metaphysically. Actually, he said much more, but unfortunately, by nature, I have only one head to fit it all in. He called it transition. Everything was great, we were drinking, our company was growing, and then Viktor Andreevich somehow abruptly changed, became very morbid in appearance. He asked where we had health correction centers, to which we laughed. He was looking for all sorts of mobile recovery centers, and told us that in his world they were on every corner. Free medicine. Then, for the first time, he touched on something he had never told us before. Nora and Penchia excitedly questioned him about the world he came from. Within a few days, he had gone completely blind and was giving out little bits of information that were very hard to believe. He said that there was no religion at all in his world, and there had never been Christianity. Since the church didn't pursue science, the technological revolution happened in the 11th century, according to our chronology. That mankind flew to the moon in 1490, and there have been no wars for over 200 years, just as there are no states and no money. Artificial intelligence reigns over everything, which calculates what is happening and builds a harmonious society. He told me that he found one wrong variable in his world, which helped him to find his way to our reality. And then he told how he came to our world and asked to fulfill his last will, to take him to the fore. He said he needed to get to his place, heal, and he would surely come back for us. We didn't believe him, even as we loaded him into the elevator and closed the metal cage behind him. He told me everything. Until the last minute, I hoped it was just a crazy grandfather who liked to get drunk, and then the elevator left. He was gone about 10 minutes. It came back empty, no one inside. Lestat finished. Then he came back, didn't he? I asked. That's the thing. We thought he'd heal and come back, but it's been more than 7 years since that day, and he hasn't come back. And you really believe in his fairy tales about the moon in the 15th century and a world without wars? More than I believe, I know it's possible to get there. The day had been psychotic enough as it was, but Lestat's last words made it sound like he was going crazy, even with all the confusion that was going on. What is it? Another unbelievable ritual. I'm afraid to imagine. I wanted to continue my thought, but Lestat interrupted me. That's the thing, you don't need anything. You have already completed the correct sequence by going through all the necessary rituals. If you were an ordinary mortal, there would be nothing, but in your case, the outcome would be different. You just go into the elevator, press the number 4 3 times, and on the 4th press it and wait. The elevator touches and starts to go. You'll be going, at some point the emergency phone will ring. I've said it before, but I'll say it again, it's not exactly a regular elevator, it's a shaft elevator assembled from shit and sticks. The floor button panel is from a 9-story building altogether. Since it's a shaft elevator, there's a telephone in case of an emergency. It rings and that's it. That's it? You answer it and that's it. Aha, I see. It's that simple. How hard should it be? The road to a better world is only deceptive at first steps. The closer you get to the transition, the easier it is. And there's no catch? Ghosts? Brutality or anything like that? No. What about you? What about us? We're right behind you, no offense, Malloy children, women and old people first. I'm the last one to go, to make sure everything's under control. I've got that nasty feeling again. Fear of falling down in the eyes of the company, of being a coward. Okay, I said, and we went to Sure-Wheel's car. All the week that followed, the whole world seemed to be pushing me to lean in favor of the transition. Although the whole story I had a strong distrust. My parents fought constantly, and my father left home for days at a time. The majors in the class got the courage to start harassing me again, saying that if I brought my elders again, they would file a police report against them. It was as if everything around me was shrinking, pushing me to want a transition. I imagined a better world in different ways. The closer was the day appointed by Lestat transition, the more I wanted to get there. On the last night before the appointed day, I could not sleep. Contrary to my expectation that everything would take place with long pauses, beautiful speeches, in a halo of ritual mystery, everything from beginning to end took place in a hurry. Lestat was not himself, looking around, talking. He was confusing the people around him by name, running back and forth. Perhaps someone else in my place would have realized it then, though someone else in my place probably wouldn't have. There were too many things that said something bad was coming. I even think Uncle Igor, when he called me dickhead again, said something else. I can't remember what. Something like, "You understand everything. Go home. There's no going back." He habitually threw himself at me, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck. We were separated, and he was dragged away somewhere by Pussy and Nora. Lestat kept running around the house, not going inside. Kamarina and Hungry were standing at the front door. They went in and out one by one, and then ran to Lestat and said something to him. From what he heard, he would go somewhere in the shadows of the courtyard again, and then call out to them again. Their behavior was very strange. All this fuss was transmitted to me. I began to get nervous. For all those stories, the building of the fort was not very creepy from the look of it. It was an ordinary 5-storied building, with a couple of windows with light in them. Their fidgeting lasted about half an hour, and then Lestat came running toward me. "It's time." We went inside, and it was only there, crossing the threshold, that I realized why they were telling such horrible stories about this house in the city. The atmosphere, everything from the yellow, murky light to the stale air smelled of suffering. A thick, slow, and lifeless sense of longing. I wanted to turn back, to turn as fast as I could, to run home, but Lestat was in a hurry and wouldn't listen to me. "Hurry, we don't have much time. Hurry to the cage," he said, and opened the iron bars of the elevator. "What's the rush? Is everything all right?" I asked. "Yes, it's fine. Come in," he said, and didn't even look at me. For some reason I went in, even though I knew with all my might that I shouldn't. Lek, listen, no offense, but I somehow don't like all this, I don't know," I said, calling him by his name. By this time he had already closed the elevator from the outside, and was standing sideways to me. "Just do it right 3 times for, on the 4th you press and hold. Then it'll ring." What am I even gonna be asked? "Kid, there's really not much time. Press the buttons." I started pressing and repeating my question. I pressed 3 times, and on the 4th time I pressed the button. The elevator moved. "What will they ask, Leka?" "What question?" I asked, shouting over the noise of the elevator. "I'm sorry," Lestat shouted. "What?" I heard Kane's, "Hello, sorry," he repeated even louder. The elevator moved upward for a moment and then began to slowly creep downward. I saw Lestat standing in the entryway. One last time he didn't even look in my direction. He couldn't look. "Excuse me?" The fear of the elevator going down instead of up made me let go of the button. But it was too late. The elevator was going. It was slowly going down into a depth that couldn't be here. Frantically, I pressed all the buttons, must have pressed the damned for 100 times. A minute passed, then another. The hazy light of the yellow lamp was barely enough to see any movement outside the cubicle. The elevator was moving, going down to nowhere. Pressing the buttons didn't change anything, it just kept going and going. By my subjective measure, the movement lasted more than 20 minutes. 20 minutes of cold terror, fear, and incomprehension. The cell phone didn't respond in any way. Black screen. I was completely alone. Things had gone too far. The elevator light was no longer shining, only blinking occasionally as the elevator shuddered, and that's when the emergency phone rang. Picking up the receiver, I was silent. It was scary to speak. A beep. The silence at the other end of the line was broken by a woman's voice full of anxiety. "Hello, is that HPV2? Shivers of fear ran through my body. The voice began to echo. How do I know that phrase? At the same time as this woman, dozens of other voices began to ask questions. It was as if they were all calling the ambulance, police, and fire departments at once, asking for help, begging for help. Hundreds of voices at different intervals asking to be saved, begging. Others were added to them, some screaming, others devolving into helpless sobs. The more they became, the more they merged into an unintelligible noise. Reaching its peak, the noise subsided. The emotionless voice in the receiver said slowly, "Give me the number." It was scary to answer anything. "Give me the number." I pulled myself together and hesitantly said, "4?" The voice on the other end was silent for only a couple of seconds, then said, "There is no such number." That phrase was followed by a steady beep. Whoever was there hung up. At the same time, the light inside reappeared, and a moment later the concrete partitions of the floors began to peek out behind the elevator car. Still going down, we arrived at the first floor, the same place it was when I went inside the elevator. Same dirty entryway, same murky light inside. Believe me, if I were to describe in detail all the varieties of fear I experienced that night, all my feelings, my story would never end. I wanted to see our company as soon as possible, so I ran outside. But there was no one outside, just the quiet, cold, and indifferent night. That time was when I was growing up. 2007. My 15th birthday. Along with those events, I was being formed, so it was very hard for me to recognize as part of myself the disappearance of all my friends in one day. They were all gone. The numbers were invalid, and I didn't know how to look for them any other way. The places where we usually hung out were empty. Other than them, I had no other acquaintances outside of school, nor did I have any mutual acquaintances with them. There was only one photo of very poor quality, where the dark lighting made it hard to make out anything, and that was it. I even thought that I made it all up because of loneliness, and for many years, for me, it was the official version of the events of that time. After they disappeared, everything went back to normal. Music school again, time zero until the wee hours of the morning, school, and parental arguments at home. Life went on. The year 2007 was over, just as the 8th, 9th, and 10th years ended. Music school, and my parents' relationship ended. They moved away to different families, and I left to study in Odessa, where I later put down roots. Time flew until 2020, until the pandemic started. Before that, I saw my parents only once every few years on holidays, and in October my father fell ill with coronavirus and was hospitalized. By then, he had been living alone for a long time, and it was necessary for me to visit him in the city to help him in case of anything. My father, after his divorce from my mother, did not have children in new families, so my room, the one in which my adolescence had passed since I had moved out, stood untouched. Posters on the walls, a second Sony, and my old computer, which I last ran when I lived with them. By that time, I was already quite a sentimental person, often indulged in nostalgia, preferred to rewatch movies and TV series that I had already seen, replay old games. I turned on my computer. and froze with awe when I saw the shortcut Time Zero on the desktop. By then, the game that had been around for 16 years had been closed for months. I was disappointed to learn that it had been discontinued in August, just a couple of months short of the deadline. I opened the root folder of the game and started looking for the folders where the chat and private message logs were stored. I wanted to plunge into the bottomless depths of nostalgia, to read the crazy nightly correspondence with my co-clansmen, to remember that time. The chat archive is so organized that for storing the logs of the game chat itself, each character with whom you corresponded within the game has its own folder with date and time. The same applies to private messages. I want to emphasize my old computer stood in my parents' house since I moved out, disconnected, in the closet. Since 2010, with the move to the dorm, I had a laptop, and that old computer was just dusty and no one used. So when I found the Lest It folder in the logs, dated July 31st, 2022, I was very surprised. There was just one long private message, which I'll give below. Hi Malloy, if you're reading this it means you're alive, sorry to be frank, but it's easier for me to think you're dead, easier to think you haven't gotten as far as I think you have. Do you remember how many times you pressed 4 in the elevator? I have a sneaking suspicion you went a little overboard, but whatever. You were probably wondering what happened that night, trying to figure out where everyone went and why nothing happened. Now it's probably safe to tell you the truth that I knew. It's nothing personal, it's the way of the world. Do you remember Viktor Andreevich? The one who called himself my father. Remember he talked about a world without wars, flying to the moon and free medicine? He wasn't lying, he really came from there, from that world. He climbed down from the top until he found himself in our reality. Dirty, trashed, and hopeless. You wouldn't believe why he was looking for me, his son. Said I was the variable that caused the equation to be inherently wrong because it implied infinity in its answer. Quantum error. He was a pretty smart grandfather. Said a lot of things, especially things that I had come to be silent about. He told me about the infinite vertical, where at the top is a world without religion, money, or war, and closer to the bottom is the space of slow energy, the triumph of matter. A place where pain, suffering, fear, and grief seek to go. A depth where external pressures are so high that those who inhabit it are transformed, become ugly like deep-sea fish. The journey down is endless. You've noticed that nothing much has changed since your transition, haven't you? The world's the same. I'm new here. There's no coronavirus epidemic where I came from, but you have. That's the first difference. And there are more little things like that and more than you can imagine. You probably have a question. Why did I go somewhere if I knew all this? It's funny, you have endless possibilities, but all these possibilities are limited by one function. Don't make things worse for yourself. It's very simple. If you started a downward movement, your polarities change. Reality will push you out. Strive to self-regulate. With getting into another world, you are already a mistake that needs to be corrected. We are used to a good pill against a bad illness from childhood, but reality adjustment works in a different way. Against the bad, it exposes the even worse. The ugliness is answered by more ugliness and so on to infinity. Viktor Andreevich realized this almost immediately and told me the principle. Either you feed the abyss or it eats you. I'm sorry, Malloy, but I had to feed you. All the potential of your future, your possible future. I know it sounds like wild nonsense, and I envy those for whom this information will remain so, but by swallowing someone innocent, reality temporarily forgets about the need for correction. Remember our huge company? I had to feed it all of them. It went smoothly at the beginning, and then they came after me more and more often, and I had to shove people into the elevator. Without Viktor Andreevich's rituals, get them drunk, drugged, and sent them all the way. This, as you've probably guessed by now, did not end well. Everyone started to get crushed. Even those who were sent against their will and didn't know the consequences. They are coming after everyone. Maybe there's too many of us, maybe I screwed up. I'm really sorry. Remember Uncle Igor, who was always fucking with you? He wanted to warn you. He tried more than once. They got to him in this world. He got tired of running, didn't want to go any further, and hanged himself. A year earlier, Kamarina killed herself by gassing herself. Shurikaliso, Oil and Pstez drove into the wall of a house at a speed of 200. Hungry, gray-haired Sergei, Mother Valia and Mirage seemed to keep running, descending into another, worse reality until they are found there again. I think soon they'll give up too. Kid, try to be strong. You're probably wondering who's chasing you and why you should run. I don't want to scare you, but even now, if you look closely, you'll start to notice them. It won't be obvious. You may find their behavior strange, some illogical actions. You'll notice how neighbors from your house will go to the garbage can once a day with empty buckets, scoop up a bucket of garbage and carry it home. It's going to be something very close to something like that, but it's out here in the shallows. They're going to harass you, drive you crazy, make your life unbearable. They'll start small, little by little. You'll start to see crowds of different strangers following you around. In supermarkets, they'll try to steal your groceries from your cart, make perfect nonsense. That's a gentle hint. It's best to leave already then, before it's too late. That's a pretty poor deal. If you stay, life will be hell. You have to leave, but the only place to go is hell. There's no destination, only a path. Looks like each of us will have to become a bit of a samurai. Viktor Andreevich said there's a third way, that you could extinguish your mind and become invisible in the world. Apart from his education, he was also an esotericist, hence his love of meaningless rituals. He believed in the proper sequence of events and emotional upheavals. Honestly, I have no idea why he did it with us, and later he did it with you, but I guess it made sense. He believed that if you didn't react in any way, reality would consider you a part of its canvas, stop singling you out, and maybe forget about you. It didn't help me much, so I'll give you some old-fashioned advice. Don't drag it out. It won't work. It's better to make the transition as soon as possible, and you'll have some quiet time. The world will be the same, just a little different, worse than it was before. You'll have a month or a year, and then they will start getting close to you. Don't procrastinate, move on right away. The rules haven't changed. 3 short presses and 1 long press. Same damn 4. All this time I've been wondering why they were killing themselves. Why kill themselves when you can always move on, take a break, and when the pressure's on, move on again? You can live forever, but instead, they killed themselves. Now I think I understand. Well, you'll understand soon enough. That's the kind of message that comes out of the blue. The only real proof of Lestat's existence. Over the years, I don't really remember what he looks like. I remember him as an actor from Queen of the Damned, but I don't remember the man. My father was in the hospital for more than a month, and he was discharged. Then I went to my place back to Odessa. About 6 months later, I realized for the first time what Lestat meant. Maybe some of you have heard of the Starokany market in Odessa. On weekends, it turns into an endless labyrinth of spontaneous trade, where you can find the craziest junk. They sell literally everything there. One thing that caught my eye was the prosthetics. 2 prosthetic right hands, a worn plastic leg next to it. They were lying in a row on a red mat. Next to them, there were dental bridges and crowns lined up in 2 even lines. Teeth. Real human teeth. From that day on, I began to see people with dentures very often. I saw them every day. And if they were just dentures, one of these people on the streetcar touched my hand on the handrail with his denture, and it was warm, as if it were alive. And then I started to notice that it wasn't just a coincidence, and something was wrong all around. Advertisements for prosthetics. Prosthetic arms, prosthetic legs, prosthetic heads, prosthetic babies. Amputation commercials. Hot price. Amputations for the whole family for the holiday. Prosthetics for bread. Amputations for the internet. Prosthetics for street trash. Amputations for houses. Amputations for skies. Today only. Hot price. Get in before the amputations and prosthetics of the new year. It was slowly driving me crazy. At that moment, I realized I needed to make the transition. I arrived at my place in the city and calmly walked to the elevator. Repeated the sequence of numbers. I got down. I'm not too scared anymore. I guess I've just been out of my mind for a long time. I just want to live in peace for a while. Not much of a choice. A couple months were quiet and then it started again, this time without the amputation. Now they talk periodically. The doctor for knee pain recommended I eat squat, even wrote me a prescription. Asked him back 5 times. He looked at me like I was stupid. Eat squat and you'll be healthy. Squats for joint pain, gout, and inflammation. Squats to keep your squats in check. On TV, they advertise squat-based medicines, ointments, and pills. In the commercials, an elderly woman squats by dabbing her squats. I don't know what those of our former company who committed suicide heard or saw, and what Lestat meant I never understood. That sort of thing doesn't scare you, it just slowly drives you crazy. Lestat mentioned a third way, my last hope for him. I've been meditating for 6 months, and I'm slowly getting my mind under control. Ignore all the nonsense, the wrong manifestations of reality. It's like they're retreating, surrendering. I want to believe in salvation. Lastly, I have 2 pieces of news for you, good news and bad news. The bad news is that you are not living in the best version of reality, since you are reading this. If you are reading this, alas, we are in the same slice. The good news is that there are much scarier realities out there, and you're most likely not in them. I made my last transition yesterday, just in case. Now I'm going to start my life from scratch. A new life. I believe things will get better. I believe in the third way. Today is February 22nd, 2022. So far, so good. It's quite normal here. There is a strong feeling that all the terrible things are far behind me. Thank you all for reading my story to the end. I think in a couple days I'll finally get outside for a walk. Hopefully nothing bad will happen again.